Wisdom begins in surprise and ends in wonder. It is said the wise person understands the relative worth of things, and that experience is a prerequisite. Of course, there are no guarantees. And the stock comic character Pantaloon reminds us that old age doesn't necessarily end in wisdom. The experiences of a life can be misinterpreted. Having had the most experiences, the old have the greatest chance to understand and misunderstand the world. The old have the ability to be both the most foolish and the wisest. Ideally, with experience, the maturing writer learns what questions should be asked and to be patient in searching for answers. One hopes the writer's mature voice ends up in well-measured and clearly spoken words instead of a childish treble and foolish whistle. Each age, as I have said, seems to suggest habits of language with its lessons. I believe one aspect of wisdom is knowing what questions to ask, and another is knowing which of those questions can be answered. Old age seems naturally to turn to a lifetime of experience as the basis both for raising and answering questions which are often rhetorical because the answer is framed even before the question is asked. Answering questions based on their experiences is probably what earns old age its reputation among the young for being garrulous, too talkative. Indeed, when the young ask a question, the old often answer a different question, telling the young what they ought to know regardless of what they asked. Probably some modern readers feel like Cicero's essay on old age is rather long-winded. His anecdotes and digressions may not interest us. Get to the point and be done, we think. Nonetheless, the essay has been read for its ideas for 2,000 years. We should be able to accept some information we are not familiar with. The sensible young listen to the voice of experience even when they disagree or don't fully understand. Thinking of Cicero's essay on old age and Jaques' description of Pantaloon, the rhetorical lessons of old age suggest elements that both expand and attempt to measure experience. In this lesson, I will describe some rhetorical elements that try to measure a world too wide, a world whose margins fade as one moves into old age. Cicero is famous for his periodic and parallel sentences, and I will add to our discussion of those sentence patterns in this lesson. I will add parison to the figures of speech previously covered, and to the tropes, I will comment briefly on the use of rhetorical questions. Since I will use examples from Cicero's essay to illustrate this lesson, it is important to remember the original essay was composed in Latin. We are reading the essay in translation. Fortunately, the translator has maintained something of Cicero's style. Though some qualities of a language are always lost in translation, the elements of rhetoric we are studying have largely been maintained. If you wish for a quick-paced, business-like prose, a Ciceronian style is too rich and too full. But if you wish to weigh an idea carefully, to discuss the many parts of an idea, the Ciceronian style offers many possibilities. Cicero is famous for his long, periodic, and parallel sentences. In earlier lessons, I have discussed parallelism as pairing together and expressing important ideas in similar structures. The scholar W.K. Wimsatt, in a well-known study of Samuel Johnson's prose style, defines parallelism far more carefully. Parallelism demonstrates the habit of collecting and distinguishing information, and to do it effectively requires mature reflection. According to Wimsatt, parallelism occurs when there is some kind of immediate equality with reference to a third element, and this supported by some equality of form. Wimsatt identifies three explicit ways of binding groups of words, of indicating parallel: by the use of conjunctive or disjunctive words, by the syntax of words, and by the repetition of identical words. For example, if idea X and idea Y are stated in reference to a subject A, they are in some degree parallel. Their parallelism will be increased depending on how they are joined. Reading the essay on old age, you see or hear many parallel ideas. Consider the following passage from Cicero's essay in his response to the complaint that old age keeps one from participating in active affairs of the state. Cicero gives the following words to Cato in these two long sentences. Those who deny that old age is involved in active affairs are asserting nothing. They are like those who would say that the helmsman is doing nothing during a voyage, when some others are climbing the masts, others are turning along the gangways or running along the gangways, others are pumping on the bilge, while the helmsman, holding the tiller, sits quietly in the stern. He may not do what the young men are doing, but he is really doing much greater and better things. Great affairs are not accomplished by strength or speed or swiftness of bodies, but by planning, authority, deliberation, things which old age is not deprived of, but which even then increase. The subject A of the passage is stated in the opening sentence. Those who deny that old age is involved in active affairs are asserting nothing. The second sentence in the passage begins with two ideas. We can call them X and Y. X, he may not do what the young men are doing, but he is really doing much greater and better things. I can say that X and Y are parallel to A, as they both are stated in relation to that subject. The parallel qualities are increased by virtue of all three ways of binding parallel ideas identified by Wimsatt. Conjunctive, well, in this case, disjunctive words are used in this sentence. He may not do what the young men are doing, but he is really doing much greater and better things. The syntax of words is similar. The pronoun subjects open, followed by verb phrases, each of which contains an adverb. The verb phrases are each followed by an object. He may not do what the young men are doing, but he is really doing much greater and better things. Obviously, several words are also repeated. Consider another example. These three characteristics of parallelism are also evident in the second clause in this same long passage. Look at the second clause in the first sentence. Those who deny that old age is involved in active affairs are asserting nothing. They are like those who would say that the helmsman is doing nothing during a voyage, when some others are climbing the masts, others are running along the gangways, others are pumping out the bilge, while the helmsman, holding the tiller, sits quietly in the stern. The subject A is, they are like those who would say that the helmsman is doing nothing during a voyage, when W, some others are climbing the masts, others are running along the gangways, others are pumping out the bilge, while the helmsman, holding the tiller, sits quietly in the stern. The four ideas, W, X, Y, and Z, are all parallel in relation to the opening idea of A. The words when and while contrast the three ideas of W, X, and Y with the idea Z. Each of the four phrases share a similar syntax. This is easily seen. Others are climbing the masts. Others are running along the gangways. Others are pumping out the bilge, while the helmsman holding the tiller sits quietly in the stern. The obvious repetition of others also binds the parallel ideas. The fourth idea is a little different than the first three. Grammatically, holding the tiller is a participial phrase or adjective modifying the helmsman. The verb sits expresses a restful idea contrasting with the activity of the sailors, but the participial phrase holding the tiller describes the helmsman duty in the same way The others are identified by their activities. It is also interesting to note that others is an indefinite pronoun. One could name the sailor's duties aboard the ship, but they are left in a general group, whereas the helmsman is identified with a concrete noun. He is given a significant title. Finally, though, the helmsman sits. The fact that he is doing something extremely important while sitting is emphasized by placing his activity in parallel relation to the activities of the others, and then more greatly emphasized by placing it last, closing the period. The syntax of the passage clearly emphasizes the idea being expressed. You can find many similar examples of parallel sentences throughout Cicero's essay. In addition to the idea of parallelism, which is easily found in Cicero, you can also find many examples of the periodic sentence as I've defined it in this course. The periodic sentence is one which reserves the main idea for the end of the sentence. The translator has achieved the effect of the periodic sentence by using the figure of speech auxesis, placing the most important idea last to complete the thought dramatically. Looking once more at each of the parallel sentences just described, you will note Cicero ends with his most important idea, and each time he ends emphasizing the positive quality of old age. The first sentence ended with attention drawn not to the activities of the others, but to the helmsman holding the tiller quietly in the stern. The second sentence in the long example ended not with the swiftness of the young, but with the planning, authority, deliberation, things which old age is not deprived of, but which even then increase. Studying Cicero's use of parallelism and the periodic sentences, even in translation, reveals how effectively these patterns can be used in developing one's ideas. As you examine Cicero's sentences, one of the obvious qualities they exhibit is length. This is partly the result of the use of parallel structures. The two sentences in the long passage we just discussed totaled 111 words. Most college papers average between 16 to 24 words a sentence. Sentences are not good because they are long or short. They are good if they make clear and effective what it is they have to say. As a rule of thumb, you will want to check for a variety of sentence lengths. Some sentences will be shorter, some longer. The length of Cicero's sentences also happens to offer a good example or a good opportunity to study some special cases of punctuation, in particular the colon. Remember, the colon is used to emphasize the relation between modifying information and the main clause. The thing to remember is that the modifying information must be connected to a complete sentence, and the information joined by the colon to the main clause should clarify the main clause. You will see colons used to join the following items to a main clause: a long quotation, a list or series of items, and a positive word or phrase, or another complete sentence which clarifies the main clause. Looking at the passage from Cicero, which we just studied, you see both sentences use the colon to join clarifying sentences to the main clause. Here is the first one. In both sentences, the main clauses which come before the colon could stand alone as complete sentences. Just as the clause coming after the colon are complete sentences that clarify the first idea, I can also illustrate the first 3 points about the colon. A colon can be used to introduce long quotations. Consider this sentence. Discussing the problem of lost strength in old age, Cicero writes, "There is a fixed course of age and one path of nature, and it is straightforward, and its own climate has been given to each stage of life." This sentence is typical Cicero. Note the main clause before the colon. It is a complete sentence. Note also how the long quotation is indented 10 spaces, And after the long quotation, the writer simply continues his paragraph, commenting on the quotation he just presented. Using the colon to introduce a series is perhaps the most common use for the colon. The writer of the sample essay could have used a colon to introduce the 4 common complaints against old age. For example, he could have written, "People believe old age will deprive them of 4 things: an active life, physical strength, all pleasures, and finally of life itself." Finally, the colon can introduce an appositive word or phrase, as in the sentence, "Cicero's sentences illustrates the virtue of the periodic structure perfectly. Suspense." The word suspense is an appositive. It renames the virtue of the periodic structure. The main thing to remember is the words that come before a colon must form a complete sentence, an independent clause. Whereas the semicolon is used to join 2 independent clauses, the colon is used at the end of one independent clause to introduce clarifying information. The discussion of parazon relates directly to the discussion of parallelism. Parazon is defined by Brian Vickers in a study of classical rhetoric and poetry as the corresponding structure of a sequence of clauses, either of the same word to same word, or adjective to adjective, noun to noun, and so on. Turning back to the essay on old age, many examples of parazon can be found. Considering the following passage, "Just as waywardness and lust are more characteristic of young men than of old men, and moreover not of all young men, but of the shameless ones, in the same way that senile foolishness, which is usually called dotage, is characteristic of flighty old men, not of all of them." The introductory clause comparing the bad qualities in young men and the bad qualities found in old age provides an example of parazon. Here the corresponding structure of a sequence of phrases, of young men and of old men, and moreover not of all young men, but of all the shameless ones. The figure of speech, parazon, is obviously a rhetorical element that results in very polished parallel sentence structures. These figures of speech reveal a fullness of experience and a willingness to observe patterns that may seem excessive to the modern ear, but which are fitting for the mature writer to understand. I'll turn now to another element of language that seems to me appropriate for this age, the use of rhetorical questions. All good writing is a response to real questions. Rhetorical questions merely state those questions openly, rather than leaving them implied by the essay. In addition, rhetorical questions, by their phrasing, can be used to direct an argument and the audience's response to that argument. In the essay on old age, Cato's use of rhetorical questions to introduce important ideas he wants to share can be used to introduce several lessons about rhetorical questions. First, of course, you really don't need to be old to use rhetorical questions, but you do need to know the answer to your question before you ask it, and you need to possess the authority to provide the answer before someone else interrupts you. If you don't know the answer to the question, or if you can't control the answer to the rhetorical question, the question in an essay can invite, and probably will receive, unwanted replies. Rhetorical questions are often interrupted with unwanted answers. This usually happens when you lack authority or the goodwill of your audience. I suspect most of us have heard a question like, "Don't you trust me?" A politician knows not to ask this rhetorical question during a debate with those opposed to him. Speaking to supporters, a politician can ask almost anything, knowing the right answer will be given or listened to. An opponent is likely to give the wrong answer and change the direction of the conversation or alter the tone of the essay. In writing a question like, "Don't you trust me?" almost immediately raises suspicion and maybe even a sarcastic "no." More complicated questions can get equally negative results if they are not handled carefully. But in the essay on old age, Cato regularly uses rhetorical questions as transitions to the next point of his argument. The reader fully expects Cato to answer each question he asks. I believe the reader of the essay identifies with the two young men introduced in the first few pages, Laelius and Scipio. They came to Cato to learn. They ask only the first questions. What is old age like? And is it easier for Cato than for others because he is well established? Cato knows he has a respectful audience, so he raises the questions necessary to develop the topic and provides the answers to his own questions. After establishing his controlling idea about old age in paragraph 9, the most appropriate defenses of all against old age are the study and practice of the virtues. Cicero uses the voice of Cato to list the four main complaints against old age, which we've already discussed. The essay is then developed responding to a series of questions. The first question Cato asks introduces his response to the idea that old age draws away from active affairs. He asks, what affairs? From the ones that are carried on by youth and strength? Then are there not affairs for old men that can be carried on by intelligence, even though their bodies are weak? Cato not only uses the rhetorical question to introduce ideas, to direct the argument, he also uses questions to direct the emotions of the audience. As Cato discusses the second complaint against old age, that it makes the body weaker, he states that he no longer desires the strength of a young man. Instead, he says, what strength there is you should make use of, and whatever you do, you should do according to your strength. To underscore his point, Cato poses the rhetorical question, what boast could be more pitiable than the one of Milo, an old athlete? Apparently, Milo complained when he was old that he could no longer compete with young athletes. Watching the young and looking down at his old arms, Milo supposedly said tearfully, "But these arms are already dead." Cato responds to Milo's complaint about dead arms, "Not really your arms as much as you yourself, babbler, for you were never ennobled on your own account." Cato's question, what boast could be more pitiable than Milo's, encourages the reader not only to think about the relative importance of strength of body compared to strength of character, but it also directs an emotional response against the idea that youthful strength is always necessary for a good life. Cato also uses rhetorical questions to introduce and emphasize his concluding thoughts. What about the fact that all the wisest men die with the most tranquil spirit, but all the most ignorant die with the most bitter feelings? Does not the soul that perceived more and further appear to you to see itself setting out for better things, while the other one, whose sight is more blunt, fails to see this? As you study Cicero's essay, you will note the questions Cato asks are significant questions which seem to serve one or more of five purposes. Rhetorical questions can be used to introduce ideas, to make transitions, to create emphasis, to encourage an emotional response, and to summarize or present conclusions. To be effective, however, you need to ask questions that lead the readers forward. The rhetorical question needs to invite serious thought, to be of real interest to the readers, and to be answered on the writer's terms. The use of rhetorical questions can be effective if they are not overused, and so long as they are not just an excuse to keep talking. Cicero's style has been influential. Imitated superficially, it may result in ornate wordiness, meaning little, or repeating the image used earlier. A Ciceronian style may end in something like Pantaloon's youthful hose, well saved, but a world too wide for his shrunk shank. To write a fully Ciceronian style would leave you with a small audience today. the language would seem unnatural. Extensive use of parallelism, of parison, flourishes of rhetorical questions and answers. These elements quickly become an excessive display like grand political speeches. But practiced wisely, Cicero's style may provide definition and emphasis to a writer's ideas. These elements will lead you naturally to seek distinctions and discover patterns in your experiences. They will help you discover the relationships that lead to understanding and wisdom.